Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. This is the fifth in our series of webinars that we are putting on for our friends, for our students, and of course for our alumni. My name is Stuart Croft and I am the Vice Chancellor of the University. And it's really good to see so many of you joining from so many locations across the globe. We have about 500 people on this webinar today. We have some of our staff and our students, we have friends in our locality, but we also have alumni from all around the globe. You are all very, very welcome. Let me tell you something about today's event. We are delighted to have the opportunity to highlight Warwick's commitment to sustainability. We have recently, through the Green Metric analysis, been judged as being the fourth greenest university in the UK, 29th in the world. But I think that what that says to us is there is still a journey that we want to travel down. We are one of a small number of universities committed to net zero carbon for emissions by 2050, but our immediate focus is decarbonising our energy supply by 2030. While we have this key drive towards sustainability, along with many other organisations, we have the challenge of how in that context to grow. A key priority for our university strategy, Excellence with Purpose, is a focus on the STEM subjects. Our council has recently approved a vision for STEM, which includes the construction of a major new science precinct on our campus. That's going to be an incredibly important development for all of us over the course of the next decade. That science precinct will include new space for the departments of chemistry and physics and the School of Engineering, enabling them to grow, to innovate, and to inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers. Our webinar today is going to explore this dilemma. How do we grow? How do we develop? How do we create a science precinct? And how do we remain and become more sustainable as an institution? And our panelists today will help answer and shape some of those questions. We have three speakers today. Our first is Professor Christine Enyu. She is the provost of our university. Chris was, before joining the University of Warwick 5 years ago, in the senior executive team of the University of Nottingham. She was also the provost, the chief executive in charge of the Malaysia campus of the University of Nottingham. She has been awarded an OBE for her services to education and particularly to international education. As provost, she is the deputy vice chancellor. She is responsible for academic resources. She is the executive board lead on sustainability, and she is our chief academic officer. Our second speaker is Johnny Waits, and it's particularly pleasing to be able to welcome Johnny and thank him for giving us time to speak directly. Johnny's a Warwick alum from 1986. He was appointed to the Waits Group board in 2008. He champions sustainability, chairing the board sustainability committee. But Johnny's work and commitment to sustainability has taken him into a number of other fields as well. Outside the company, he holds a range of positions, including an advisory board member for the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, a member of the Advisory Council of Common Land, and a trustee of the Forum for the Future. I think what we will hear from Johnny today is thinking about sustainability as a key to the long-term resilience of organisations, as well as humanity and the planet itself. He is a fourth generation owner of the Waits Group, an enterprise with a strong focus on operational sustainability and an awareness of the responsibility to play a role in the promotion of the sustainability agenda in the wider world. Our third speaker is Professor Georgia Cremida, Professor and Director of Studies in Civil and Environmental Engineering in our School of Engineering. In her role as Director of Studies, she is responsible for providing academic leadership in developing courses and curriculum, as well as liaising with industry, coordinating and developing new programs, and also being Director of Student Recruitment. In that role, she provides strategic leadership to planning and reviews of our recruitment activity. In her academic research and teaching interests, Georgia is involved in a number of initiatives for the development and implementation of innovations contributing to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. She is leading the Humanitarian Engineering Initiative and co-leads the Warwick Global Research Priority in Sustainable Cities. Both initiatives are bringing together students and researchers worldwide towards the delivery of resilient and sustainable communities. Georgia is also passionate about developing the pipeline of female talent into disciplines which transform societies. She has been elected Vice President of the International Network of Women Engineers and Scientists for the period 2021 to 23, and in Warwick, she is the Deputy Chair of our institutional Athena Swan self-assessment team. So we have here, I think today, an excellent panel. We have one of the core dilemmas for our development as a university, but also organizations in the economy in the future. So let us start with our first presentation from Professor Enyu. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Stuart. Welcome, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. It's great to have so many people joining us today. And it's also, I think, really exciting to be able to participate in an event such as this with our global community, but in a way that really does reduce our individual carbon footprints. And that is one of the things that I think we've discovered as a proof of concept that we can do as a consequence of the pandemic. And we need to continue to do more of that. I'm just going to provide a bit of background and context for today. I want to say something about how we're approaching the challenges of environmental sustainability here at Warwick, how we're trying to both reduce our negative impacts and enhance our positive impacts in the context of a global climate crisis. And I think in talking about this, I'd like to recognise that while many of our immediate impacts come from our own operations, one of the things that's going to really make a dramatic difference is the way in which our teaching and our research can sustain and magnify the changes that we're making currently and drive longer term impact. Next slide, please. I think it's worth saying that we've been working on sustainability and particularly managing our carbon emissions for many years. And it's nice to see that work reflected in the Green Metrics League table that Stuart mentioned earlier. Our colleagues in estates in particular have been really important in driving this development. The sort of things we've done, we've invested in self-generation. We've installed PV cells and currently have, I think, close to 3,000 PV panels around campus. Overall, and not just from PV, we generate about 50% of our electricity. We've been doing some pioneering work on battery storage, on electric vehicles, and offering a suite of degrees with a focus on global sustainable development. So I think for a number of years, there's been no lack of commitment to driving change. What we probably lacked was a coordinated and strategic framework. And in 2019, for us, as was the case for so many organisations, that changed. We made our climate commitment in that year. We articulated targets for 2030 and 2050, and we've been building the strategy to deliver against those. Obviously, they're targets that we're working on in parallel and not sequentially. But clearly the first stage is the focus on carbon emissions. We've also taken the view that we want to use the UN Sustainable Development Goals as an overarching framework for all that we do. It's there in our educational work, it's there in our research, it's there in our broader engagement, and it's there as a framework for our broader strategy in this area. And we've recently produced our first report assessing our contribution to the broader SDG agenda. We've got environmental sustainability as absolutely core to that, but we also reach out to a broader social sustainability agenda. Looking at the two sets of targets, 2030 targets focused really on scope 1 and 2, so our energy use and purchase. They're quite technical in many respects, decarbonising energy use through our buildings, whether new build or remedial work on existing building, decarbonising through the generation and purchase of energy, and through the use of smart control systems to manage our use, storage, and indeed generation of power. When we get to 2050, the targets are bringing in much more of our scope 3 impacts into play. And that involves a much greater engagement within our community. We've already started on a big programme of carbon saving activity in those areas through things like changes to travel policy. work on sustainable mobility, incentivising public transport and cycling, moving to more home working, but also looking carefully at our procurement and our sourcing activity. And of course, all of this work is underpinned by work around the biodiversity of our campus and also by engendering cultural and behavioural change. And let me just show a little bit more detail. It's not everything that we're doing, but it's some illustrative examples. Next slide, please. Now, what you'll see from that is the current profile of carbon emissions and some of the activities that we're targeting here. And underpinning this is in many senses the notion that we need to view our campus as a living laboratory. You know, and whether that's our trials around autonomous electric vehicles, our work around energy storage and management, or indeed behavioural changes. You know, we research what we do and we do what we research. The big pie chart will show you the dominance of the big three: mobility, energy, and buildings in terms of our emissions. Mobility is massive for us. We're an international university. Students will travel, staff will travel. And even though the pandemic has shown us that there's much we can do remotely, we will still need to have some travel. Interestingly, our analysis suggests that we might have had a 25 to 30% reduction in emissions due to lockdown. Massive part of that is the reduction in business and commuting travel. And thanks to Joe Cardinal in the States for providing those figures for me. Of course, we can't sustain that as a longer-term goal post-pandemic, but we can do much around sustainable transport. We can do much about more flexible delivery, and we can do much about more flexible working that will have a big impact there. We are going to talk a bit more about buildings, so I won't say much about that, but perhaps just to mention that in one of our newest projects, we've been able to secure a positive impact through the materials we've used in our new interdisciplinary biomedical research building, but also reduce carbon on all scopes through off-site construction. I'll highlight again, as a research organisation, we have significant emissions from lab activity. And one of the big projects at the moment is looking at cold storage and how we manage the range of facilities we have. We've been working around extensions to IT equipment, extending the life to reduce carbon impacts, reducing printing, a sustainable food strategy, and a massive waste and recycling strategy. Now, I haven't said a massive amount about buildings, but they are a major issue for us, both in terms of the quality and the energy efficiency, but also in terms of the volume and amount of space that we occupy. And so what I'd like to do is just finish off by saying something about a major new initiative we have in STEM that Stuart mentioned earlier. Georgia will say a bit more, but I'm going to just introduce the project to you briefly for now. So next slide, please. So the STEM Grand Challenge, as we're talking about it, is our vision to grow our activity in science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. It's an area that's perhaps traditionally been a little bit smaller at Warwick. It gives us a once-in-a-generation opportunity to really renew and reinvent the infrastructure that we have and to radically grow and develop our teaching and research. But in doing this, we have to ensure that our approach is aligned with the climate emergency commitment that we've made. And as you'll hear a little bit later on when we come to Georgia, one of the things that we have done is ensure that both in terms of the content of what we do, the research and teaching themes, we have the climate commitment at the heart of that, through climate change and the future of energy as major themes, but we also have an open to all philosophy to maximize shared spaces and reduce our space footprint, as well as ensuring that the construction that we put in place will serve as an exemplar of environmental sustainability here at Warwick. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour. Let me now hand back to Stuart and on to my colleagues.
Chris, thanks very much indeed for that. Let's move straight on. And let me introduce, if I may, Johnny Waits. Johnny, you're very welcome. Let's hear from you, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Stuart. And so congratulations to all of you at Warwick for the progress you're making, maybe being a bit hard on yourselves that you don't have the strategic cohesiveness, because there's just a massive amount of activity going on there, which is great to see. Anyway, great to join you all. I'm going to speak just for a few minutes to introduce you in three ways, maybe to my perspective on sustainability through the lens of Waits Group. You heard earlier that I'm a family owner and board director of Waits. I'm just going to introduce you very briefly to the company for about a minute or so you've got some sense of our scope, what we do, where we operate. I'm going to share a few thoughts on what sustainability means to us, and then I'm going to try to give you some more tangible examples of how that comes to life in the organisation. So turning to Waits first, the company was founded a long time ago, 1897. That's how I come to be a fourth generation owner. We have a UK focus, so we're not trading overseas, although in the past we have from time to time done so. We think of the built environment broadly as our marketplace, a marketplace valued at about 120 billion sterling. Our sales last year were about 1.5 billion, so that sounds like a lot, but it's relatively small in terms of market share. We employ about 4,000 people directly, and on any given day, there are probably 35,000 people working on Waits projects around the country. Our activities split broadly into two areas, development, which is both commercial development and private development. We have a commercial property business, a family housing business, and an urban regeneration business. We also have a contracting business, which is new build and maintenance. And that's spread across sectors like schools. We're very active in universities. We've worked quite recently at Warwick, actually, on the Arts Centre. Public housing, offices, public buildings, heritage buildings. We refurbished the west front of St Paul's not so long ago. We have a mechanical and electrical business, which is basically the guts of buildings, and a facilities management business. So across the built environment, there's a sort of portfolio effect, I suppose, which is by design. The final thought on Waits is that we're quite purposeful as an organisation nowadays. We do have an articulated purpose, which is to create tomorrow together. And behind that purpose lies a very carefully thought through set of values, which we hope bring that purpose to life. And one of them is to be sustainable. So turning to sustainability, what does it actually mean to us? Well, there's a lot. We had a sense 4 or 5 years ago that there was a great deal of disruption going on in the world around us, and it was making us anxious, actually. So we did a piece of research that took the best part of 6 months. We reached out to many different stakeholder groups with the help of a third party and tried to work out what was happening. And then once we had that full picture, an enormous amount of data and information, together we set out to understand what we really felt that meant to us. So what that this is happening or that's happening. What we were seeing was big drives of change coming through environment, through equality, through technology, to the point where we really felt that the social contract between us as an organisation and the community that we served was ripe for change. So lots of dynamics, lots of change going on. And in some ways, it played into the way the family have always thought about what we're here for. Our common cause as family owners is to hand on a stronger enterprise to Generation 5. So interesting about that statement is the word stronger, because in the past it might have meant economically stronger. And nowadays, in the modern Waits, it really means an organisation that's strong economically, environmentally, and socially. So there's been a real shift in the balance of those things. I think sustainability also has really shifted from being something of a marginal function that we did because it was the right thing to do, and we always did do good things. But now it's squarely in the crosshairs of opportunity and risk for the organisation. The subject of sustainability is of interest far beyond the sustainability team or those that happen to care about the environment or social justice. Now everybody's interested, the whole board is interested, the whole family is interested. And that's because this is a central business issue nowadays. So turning to some of the things that we're doing specifically, it's like a forest fire of activity on our projects and on our bids. And that's being influenced by changing legislation, but it's also really being driven strongly by what clients want. It's so interesting to hear Christine talking about Warwick and what Warwick is wanting. We as a contractor have an opportunity to respond to those client needs and to develop new propositions. And we're doing it in a tactical ad hoc way exceptionally well. I think Waits is a very, well, customer orientated and agile organization. The thing about these shifts and this change is that it needs to be more cohesive and more strategic. And that's where the organization is grappling, wrestling. It's very messy, but change, this is at the heart of change, and it is very messy. The great thing for us is that I think there is a common understanding about what's happening. I think there is a common understanding and commitment to what needs to be done to react and adjust our organizational posture vis-a-vis sustainability. So it's not just individual projects where we're doing great things. I won't go into too much detail about that because there's limited time, but perhaps in the Q&A it might come out a bit more. We have an off-site manufacturing facility based not far from Warwick University, from the campus. It's based in Coventry, called Prism. It's small, but it's developing a really good modular capability and a low carbon design capability, which the market really wants. We have something called Waits Sustainable Technology Services, which is effectively a broker where we scan the market for brilliant low carbon products and businesses, and then we match those products and businesses to our clients and to the projects where we're working. We're doing loads and loads of employee training around the environmental and the social justice agenda. Diversity and inclusion falls very much within the scope of sustainability as far as we're concerned. So it isn't just environmental, it absolutely is social as well, both with communities that we serve, but also with our own internal stakeholders, our employees. We care very much about that. And we have some very bold targets that we've set on the back of that horizon scan that I mentioned. So we have an intention to be against scope 1 and scope 2 to be zero carbon by 2025, to be zero waste from operations by 2025, to be nature positive by 2025, and an even bolder ambition to be zero carbon with scope 3 by 2030. They are frightening as targets, I find. My confidence level in us achieving them is so-so, but I'm just thrilled that actually it's non-family management, because the family in the business nowadays are non-exec, but that the management believe this is important enough to commit in this way. So I think if there's something I'm looking for in the future, it's that piece around cohesion and something that's a touch more strategic to the way we're doing things at the moment. We're reacting brilliantly, but I think we need to get on the front foot as an organization. We need to put investment into skills, into data and software. We need to put skills, investment into measurement and how we measure. We need to develop the narrative so we can talk about it more cohesively and coherently than perhaps I am now. And I think out of all of that's going to come some incredible opportunity for the company. And I hope a big dose of inspiration as well, because I think that helps a lot. And I think there is something emotional about this subject. It isn't just about measurement and things. Okay, so I think that's probably enough. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but if I can hand back to you, Stuart.
Johnny, thanks very much indeed. You've certainly given us some good things there, I think, to pick up on later. So our third speaker, let me introduce, if I may, Professor Georgia Kremida. Georgia, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Vice Chancellor, thank you very much for the introduction, and many thanks for having me on this panel today. My talk for today is having the title Building Up Sustainability, and I think there is no surprise here, as I am a civil engineer and I really enjoy building stuff up. So with my talk, I will attempt to provide you with my own perspective on sustainability and on how engineers working in academia and in the industry have a very important role to play in embracing sustainability in construction, in research, and teaching and learning. Next slide, please. So I think Chris and Johnny have set the context perfectly well on the commitment that we should all put on sustainability. And if we look closer, the truth is really inconvenient. The built environment accounts for 42% of total UK carbon emissions. 69% of the built environment's operational emissions arise from heating. 32% of landfill waste comes from the construction and demolition of buildings. And you would be surprised to know that approximately 13% of products which are delivered to construction sites are sent directly to landfill without being used. So I think from all these data, you can appreciate that the construction industry can play a very, very important role in meeting strategic targets to sustainability. I can further say on that the in-use building emissions account for the largest proportion, over 80% of the CO2 emissions that the construction industry has the ability to influence. And if we really want to put that on a human scale, if an individual goes vegan, they will reduce their own carbon footprint by around 2 tons per year. A typical structural engineer responsible, let's say, for 4,000 square meters of new building per year is responsible for 1,000 tons of carbon per year. So every 1% saving by this structural engineer is 5 times more than going vegan and 10 times more than flying to New York. And just to give a further hint on that, the superstructure of a London high-rise building can easily have an embodied carbon footprint of 100,000 tons. So why am I saying all these things? I'm saying all these things because I want to make the point that engineers, whether they are working in the industry or they are working in academia, they have a very, very important role to play with sustainability, either by providing sustainable engineering solutions or by preparing the future generations of engineers with a mindset to sustainability. Next slide, please. So I think that here at Warwick, our engineering, and in particular our civil and environmental engineering teaching and research priorities are strongly aligned to sustainability. Our priorities are focused to climate emergency. The crisis of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss are the major issues of our time, and our civil engineers are advocating for the main infrastructure systems of transport, energy, water waste, flood defenses to be transformed into more carbon efficient solutions for the whole life of projects. We are also very strongly aligned, as Chris said, to the UN Sustainable Development Agenda of 2030. We are working strongly against a number of sustainable development goals, as for example, the Sustainable Development Goal 6 on water and sanitation. It only takes to say that about 800 million people cannot access safe drinking water, and about 2.5 billion people have no access to proper sanitation facilities. Or I could be mentioning the Sustainable Development Goal 11 on sustainable cities. More than 50% of the world's population is living on cities, and the figure is growing very, very fast. And this places greater demand on housing, infrastructure, provision of water and sanitation and food and energy. Another priority for us is the material efficiency. So here we are working on the principle of doing more with less. So this means that we are using the material resources in a sustainable manner while minimizing their environmental impact. And there are a number of ways to do that, either by directly using fewer materials or by optimizing the use of materials, preventing waste, or using materials which are reclaimed or that they have a higher recycled content. Of course, we are also working strongly with applications of artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things for delivering smart, connected structures which are improving the occupants' experience. They are increasing also the operational efficiency, and they are ensuring space and asset utilization. Next slide, please. So with regards to the Warwick STEM Grant Challenge, for myself as a globally responsible engineer, but also as an academic, I believe that this is Warwick's strongest commitment to sustainability, well-being and inclusion. And I see it as a clear means of empowerment for us academics and our students to enact and lead change. So from an engineering perspective, the facility will deploy highly sustainable approaches to design, construction and operation, ensuring energy and cost savings and occupant health and well-being. And as Chris said, this is going to be a living lab from an academic perspective, which will enable direct interaction with the environment. For myself as an educator, the facility will act as a 3D educator itself and will expose our students to a number of innovative engineering applications, embedded sensors, for example, for live data, energy infrastructure, advanced mechanical systems, building management systems, and similar. And the last point that I want to make here is that the facility is going to be structured on a super labs model with smart technology facilitating interdisciplinary large cohort teaching and learning and integrating research and teaching, which you appreciate that these are all elements which are very much needed for creative and innovative education and research. So here I would like to thank you very much for having me on the panel once again and express my thanks to everyone for listening.
Georgia, thanks very much indeed. So there we are, colleagues. We have our full set of presentations for you now. Let's move on to discussion. Thank you to those who've submitted some questions in advance. We've received quite a high number, as you'd expect, and we will try to get through as many of the topics as possible. But I'd like you to add to it. I see some already, you are experienced webinar participants adding in the Q&A. You're adding comments and questions in the chat. Please, please, please do continue to do that. And what we'll do now is use the best part of the next half an hour to try to cover as many of these topics as possible. So I'm going to start, if I may, with a couple perhaps from those that have been submitted beforehand. And Johnny, I'm going to turn to you first, if I may, with a question from Melissa. And she makes the assertion that the more sustainable a building is, the more it is likely to cost.
Yeah.
And then she asks how you rank sustainability against cost and indeed against safety as well. Johnny.
Yeah, it's a great question. You're probably right. I mean, in many cases, it will be more costly. I think it's fair. There is a big investment dimension to all of this to adapt an organization to be effective environmentally and socially. It's not a cheap thing to do, and that transmits to projects as well. In terms of how you measure, I don't think you can ever trade off safety with anything. In our industry, there is an obsession nowadays about safety. And it's something that we as owners of the company, we wear it on our sleeves. It's the most important thing that we do, and that we never compromise on safety. So there isn't really a sort of if the suggestion was there may be a trade-off, there can't be a trade-off. And if that means there's greater cost, then that means there's greater cost. But overall, I'm excited about this agenda because I think it presents as much opportunity as it does challenge. I think the opportunity for us as an organization is to develop propositions. You saw how big a components of carbon profile buildings are, but yet you'll probably be aware, all of you, that we haven't been legislated at in quite the same way as maybe the automotive industry, or we haven't seen the changes that we're seeing in energy with the shift towards renewables. So the building industry is ripe for change, and we're excited about that. Collaboration is going to be important, and it's exciting to see how much Warwick is doing. In fact, we're doing lots of collaboration with the further education sector as well. So I'm not sure it is a trade-off. I'm determinedly optimistic. Put the emphasis on the upside. We recognise the risks, but I'll be optimistic about those changes.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks very much indeed. I'm going to turn to Georgia, if I may. In the chat a little while ago, Mike Bradshaw was talking about the things that will bring about change, how much change will be brought about by technology, how much by behavioural change. And some of the people, of course, who bring together both behavioural change and technology are engineers. And so, Georgia, Anderson Clayton asked the question, what's the best way to encourage our students to make engineering sustainable?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And I think before we start considering the ways to engage and encourage our students on sustainability, it would be really useful to appreciate the key features of sustainable development itself. So, for example, for myself, sustainable development is an ongoing process of creating a better world. It is a long-term goal. And if I were to speak as an engineer, I think that sustainability is all about making informed decisions and responsible actions for environmental integrity, economic viability, and a just society for present and future generations. So if I want to become now very specific into answering this question, I think that we shall always remind to our students that they are having a vested interest in the future of our planet and our society. We shall support them, of course, to develop scientific and technical competencies, but at the same time, to provide them with motivation to pursue sustainable visions of their own future, I would say. We need to challenge them, we need to support them and enable them to co-design solutions. And really to conclude on my answer, I think that we shall encourage them across the whole spectrum of their learning experience. So definitely this encouragement should come from their curricula and the programs of studies, but it should also be reflected on the student life, their living on campus, and their active involvement to communities.
Thanks very much, Georgia. Thank you. Johnny, I'm going to come back to you because there's a couple of things I think that have been connected to what you said and perhaps also inspired by what you said. Malcolm's just said on the chat, asking the question about how the sector considers the whole life cycle of costing to clients. And talk about what motor manufacturers have been doing in terms of lorry fleets and so on. And I just want to add on to that, if I may, Johnny, in the chat, Fabio is angry at us for saying 2050 in terms of scope 3. And I understand that. Why are we looking at 2050? Well, because we need to find real ways of getting from 2050 to 2045 to 2040. Now, you, Johnny, have said that in your organization, scope 3, your aim is to achieve by 2030.
Yeah.
You probably have some quite inspirational things to tell us about how we think about that.
I did use the word frightening. I did say that also that our the way we're set up is the family and non-exec, and we have some very forward-thinking and ambitious around environment and social justice executives. And in response to the work we did on the Horizon Scan, they felt that was the right time frame. There is a really strong sense of our responsibility as an organization, and to try to do things at very high speed. And it's really interesting because our CEO sees diversity and inclusion and environment as two of the biggest levers for cultural change in the organization. So he's got his sort of 10-year vision for weights, and we as a family have a longer term vision, but in his 10-year vision, these are the key levers that he wants to use to transform the organization. I think it's fair to say. I think it's not an adaptive process. When you set a target like that, you really are you can't tweak around at the edges. It's going to be highly disruptive, I think, for the organization, the way it's structured and the way it does things, the way it allocates capital and all of those things besides. So it's not going to be easy. There was another question, Stuart, you mentioned before. Was it about the full life cycle? Yeah, I mean, I think that relatively the building industry is immature around thinking in terms of the full life cycle of buildings. There was a great point made in one of the chats about existing buildings and existing building stock. And actually, it's quite complicated and it can be costly to adapt existing buildings, but we really have to innovate and put a lot more emphasis on that, because otherwise the change will be too slow. If we wait just for new buildings to be presented or brought forward in a good way, then we won't hit the targets that we need to. And there was one more question which I'm cheekily going to pick up, which I saw about the shareholders and the investment's going to have an impact on dividends and profit. And yes, it does actually. In the short term, this will require investment, and that may affect the bottom line. But if there's ever a topic to take a long-term view, it's this one. This is not a fad. This is not going away. We have a moral responsibility, but I think we also have a commercial responsibility, a fiduciary duty almost as directors, to make sure that the organization is fit for purpose in this way, because if it's not, we will be less competitive and we'll be less strong, which will undermine the family's common cause to hand on stronger in the long run. So I think we're just going to have to accept that the cost of business is going to rise while we invest. But if we do it well and we're smart, then there may be a return for us in the medium to long term. But we're used to thinking like that as a family business.
Thanks, Johnny. Let me just focus for a moment on the 2050 question and ask Chris and Georgia in turn if you have any comments on 2050 as a target point for the university and indeed other organisations as well around Scope 3. Chris, any particular reactions, thoughts first, and then I'll come to Georgia.
Well, I think I guess my initial reflection would be that, of course, it would be fantastic if we can get there earlier, and I don't think we would rule it out. But I think when we set targets, we have to set them in a way where, you know, they're stretch targets, but they're still achievable. And of course, one of the big challenges about the kind of organisation that we are, and our networks and links globally, and the student experience, means that we will have a lot of Scope 3 issues to address. We know that there is so much more that we can do at a distance, remotely. But I think what we've also learned over this past year has been that there are occasions when actually there is no substitute for the interpersonal and the direct engagement, and particularly for our students, the campus experience. So there's a hard balance for us to get right there. And I think we set 2050, we debated it at length, but set it as a stretch, but potentially achievable target.
Thanks, Chris. Georgia, any particular reactions on 2050 on Scope 3?
I am fully aligned with what Chris just said, and myself as a person, as an individual, I'm really happy always when we are putting very ambitious targets and goals, because these are motivating everyone to be more engaged and do their best towards those goals. But definitely there are challenges that we need to pick up and address in the next period.
Thanks very much. I mean, I have to confess to a level of dissatisfaction about 2050, and it's a long way away and there's a lot to be done. But as everyone on this call knows, Scope 3 requires so much work across so many organisations and so many sectors, and that's where we really need to press. Let me move to a question, if I may, for you, Chris. There's a question that's coming here from Susan, which asks about recycled material in buildings. So will you be using recycled material in the construction? What is the anticipated lifespan of buildings? And it connects actually, I think, a little bit with something that has just come in, which I think I've known lots of. Guy has asked the question around circular economy and repurposing as well. So Chris, repurposing, recycling, new buildings, how do we think around that space? And Johnny, I might come to you for a second thought on that as well.
Sure, and I think it's fair to say, I mean, we do recycle as much as we possibly can, certainly in the construction side of things. You know, as an example, for those of you who remember where the car park was, which is now the arts building, you know, the steel from that was recycled back into the supply chain. The concrete was regraded and used as part of the foundations for that building. So absolutely, where we can recycle, we will do so. We use a lot of sustainably sourced timber, sustainable materials. But again, give you an example from the biomedical research building, which made extensive use of glulam timber, and probably sequestered about 400 tons of carbon there. So reusing, recycling, sustainable materials where we can, very evident in buildings, and we're looking to build buildings with a lifespan, say 50, 60 years, but trying to build them in a flexible way so that they can be repurposed should needs change. But let me also add, the kind of reuse, recycle approach isn't just in construction, but it's across the campus. And whether that's around, whether it's around food, whether it's around coffee cups, whether it's composting, whether it is scouring our campus at the end of term, and indeed student housing in Leamington to see what we can find, reuse, repurpose. All of those things are starting to have a massive impact in terms of reduced carbon footprint.
Chris, thank you. David's just put a really important point on the chat, which deserves a shout out. The Circular Economy Research Network on campus, which is really important as well. Johnny, any particular thoughts that you'd like to share with us about this whole issue of recycling and repurposing, and indeed sustainable materials, of course, as well, that Chris was talking about?
Yeah, a couple of observations. One is I think that the industry's got to be honest with itself about its, the state of play in responding to what Christine's talking about. As a client, Christine has a set of objectives, Warwick has a set of objectives, intentions, but if the industry is not geared up and doesn't have the solutions to support that, it's going to be slow. So there needs to be a massive emphasis on innovation. And I do think collaboration with the academic sector is one of the ways in which that can be done. And in fact, collaboration across the industry as well. So, these are systemic problems. And certainly at Waits, we think of ourselves as, yes, we want to be competitive, but we see that many of these issues, we can't move forward so quickly or effectively if we try to act on our own. So there is something called the Supply Chain Sustainability School in the UK construction industry, and it's absolutely brilliant, but it's still relatively small. And its impact in something like whole life cycle is relatively modest still. So I think I would be honest and say there's work to be done. And I think a lot of that work should focus on the front end, the design stage for new buildings. This is so much of the embodied carbon and the carbon footprint for buildings in terms of the construction process, but then the full life cycle of the building is set in stone at the time of design. So that's really where the emphasis needs to be.
Johnny, thanks very much. I've got one here that I'd like to ask Georgia, if I may. There's a question that's come in from Irem, who is, again, talking about innovation, so really building on what Johnny's just asked. And the question is that sustainability is founded upon the need for innovation. Georgia, do you believe that engineering programs can become increasingly significant in this field of the innovation side? And I know this is a subject quite close to your heart.
Oh, yeah. And of course, the direct response to this question is absolutely yes. And thank you very much for the question. It is really giving me the opportunity to speak a little bit about how I see engineering. So myself, engineering really has a pivotal role to play in sustainability, but in general, in tackling challenges. It is not only the climate change, it is also the global health. We are in the middle of a global health crisis, energy, water, resilience to disasters. All those are areas where engineering can make a very big difference. And engineering can be used, I would say, as the catalyst for change. As long as there are the economic and political drivers, of course, to allow engineers to do their creative best. So if we really think about it, the engineering profession really underpins the majority of responses that are needed for a better future. I mentioned already some of them in my talk, so from water supply, renewable energy, efficient transport systems, sustainable cities, resource protection. So all those are areas where engineers are having a very strong input. So my answer is definitely yes. Innovative and creative engineering programs are becoming increasingly significant. I'm really happy and very proud that I'm leading such programs at Warwick, and definitely engineers are playing and will continue playing a very important role for shaping our society and improving also the way that we live and we work within it.
Georgia, thanks very much. Elaine's just put something on the chat, and a few other people have about travel. I'm going to come to travel in just a moment, if I may, because I think there's a really important question that's been sent in by Jonathan. And Johnny, I'm afraid it's for you again. It's quite a long one, so let me just have a second to get through it. You'll see the point of it. Jonathan says, as a construction lawyer with a long interest in sustainability, it feels like the decarbonisation of the built environment has finally reached a tipping point positively. And I think, Johnny, that's what you're telling us as well. What, though, he says, in your view, and Johnny, I'm going to ask you this, are the biggest enablers of change to help the UK construction industry reach the legally binding net zero target of 2050? But also, what are the 2 or 3 biggest barriers? So what are the enablers? What are the barriers? How do we think about how the construction industry gets to that point?
Great question. I'll have a go. I think the first thing is understanding. We found with our own process, I mentioned that horizon scan process, it was time consuming and costly and distracting at a time when there were lots of other things going on, but it was very valuable in creating a common understanding about what was happening. So I think that is the first thing. If you want to mobilize, if you want to create a movement, if you want to bring people together and make the most of that, then common understanding is the right starting point. So I'd say that is the biggest enabler of all, in a sense, because I think when people get it and they see it, and in our case, they understand that it's doing the right thing morally, but it's actually, there's no difference between doing the right thing and being competitive nowadays. The two things are merged. That has been a really significant shift in comprehension in our business, and it's made a big difference. A couple of other things more briefly. I do think it would help to have more stringent legislation, and it might seem odd coming from a contractor developer, but I do think that automotive and the energy sector have responded clumsily, probably, but very different places 5 or 10 years into having been legislated at. So I would welcome it. And thirdly, client behavior. So here I am talking with a client, and I do think that clients being demanding of contractors in the industry in general about the standards they expect and the solutions they're looking for would be a very good thing. And in some ways, those things are the barriers as well. So maybe cutting short my answer because I've already gone on a bit, but I think if you flip them round, if those things aren't in place, they really do become an issue. And in the end, we do need to be investing. So maybe a bit of short-term pain for longer-term gain.
Johnny, thanks. I just want to excerpt out of that particular the focus on government and government regulation. There's a piece in the chat that Kevin Edwards is talking about role for government to support the sector, because as he's saying in the chat, exactly as you're saying, Johnny, progress down this road can take more cost, can take more cash, can make it difficult to do other things. So I might just turn, if I may, to Chris and to Georgia. We know that what needs to be done in terms of climate change is a global issue, but in terms of government's part of it, are there particular thoughts about what you would see government might be able to help over the course of the next decade or so, perhaps specifically higher education, but also more broadly in terms of this agenda, rather than the way that Johnny was talking about with regard to regulation? Georgia, shall I start with you and then go to Chris reverse this time round?
Yeah, that's fine. So I think I would like to focus a little bit on higher education and how the government is setting the scene for us to promote this agenda. So I can say that very recently, there has been a review in the Engineering Council's requirements. So for all of us that we are delivering engineering programs, there are more specific rules and requirements on how we are setting up our curricula, how we are setting up our programs of studies, which are very much targeted to climate change, to sustainability, to inclusion, to well-being. So for myself, as an educator, I see that as a very, very big step forward because this is a formal way to bring all these very important matters into higher education and prepare the generations of engineers to have that mindset to sustainability.
Thank you. Chris?
Thanks, Georgia. And I agree entirely. I think perhaps my two reflections would be, firstly, I think it's about ensuring that we continue to invest in research which will drive this agenda forward. A couple of days ago, we were talking about hydrogen and the potential that hydrogen offers in terms of decarbonising. But the real need to sustain investment in that and in many other areas, so that we get the fundamental research and the translational research sorted out. I think then the other big challenge I would highlight perhaps, and to some extent the government SALIX fund is trying to address this, but is the sheer capital cost of making some of the changes. And of course, technology does change unhelpfully quickly. So we invested, as I mentioned, in self-generation. We actually invested in CHP a number of years ago. And CHP now is no longer the clean technology that it, or is no longer viewed as the clean technology that it was. We'd like to look at PV. We've got a bid into SALIX, £30 million bid. So these are not trivial sums. And I think there is a real role for government in there to help overcome the hurdles that the capital cost of transition presents.
Chris, thanks very much indeed. So I did say I'd come back to transport. I mean, although a lot of those answers focus on UK government, and we've got, I understand, probably more than a third of people on this webinar are here from other parts of the world. I hope some of those issues relate to your governments as well. I do want to pick up this transport point. Elaine's asked the question, Susan's asked the question in different sorts of ways about sustainable transport, specifically around the University of Warwick. So, Chris, do you want to say something about that first? It's one of my absolute passions, so please, everyone, forgive me if I add a few comments.
I should probably just stand back and let you answer it, Stuart. But if I just say, we made a very important appointment, I think, of a colleague to really lead on this area, probably about 18 months ago, and we're now starting to see some really massive change. Working really closely with local city and district councils, and that ranges from subject dear to your heart, Stuart. I know the cycling infrastructure, the Sus-Trans routes. We've been particularly pushing hard on the new Kenilworth to Leamington route. So there's a lot around cycling and pedestrian routes. In terms of our master planning, we're moving car parks to the periphery of campus. It's a terribly unpopular thing, but car parking is becoming more expensive, as it, in my view, quite rightly should. We've been looking at electric scooters on campus. We are trialling electric vehicles. We've got the virtual light railway project that links Coventry to areas of the campus. So there's a massive amount, and I think it is about those very, very low carbon forms of transport, so cycling and walking. It's increasing the use of public transport. It's increasing low carbon forms of moving people around. And then, of course, also it's perhaps trying to do our best to discourage commuting and encourage greater home working, not just now, but as we return from the impacts of the pandemic.
Chris, thanks very much. So just a word on the Very Light Rail scheme, which is a fantastic scheme, which is being driven by Warwick Manufacturing Group and the School of Engineering. It is an extraordinary technology that is 1/7 of the cost to install when it is fully developed compared to existing surface metro systems. If we can get this funded, and here's a critical role for central government in funding infrastructure, with our partners in Coventry City Council and indeed in Warwickshire, we will have in Coventry and Warwickshire a world-leading system of very light rail that will be absolutely vital for achieving a better result than 2050 around Scope 3. And it is about, for us, I think, taking responsibility for driving some of these very specific and particular initiatives that will help us advance some of those targets. We're nearly out of time. So let me first say to Johnny, to Chris, to Georgia, thank you so much for this. It's been a really, I hope you've all found it a really, really interesting and thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion. There's been a tremendously rich discussion in the chat. I hope you do have an opportunity to look at that as well. Thank you all so much for being present. The question of HS2 has just been raised. I don't think we have time, unfortunately, to talk about it today, but I think if this is a subject, an area that people have interest, please let the team know, and I think we'd be interested in doing something else in this space if that is of interest to people. Thank you to all of you for taking part. It's been a very good discussion. I'm aware that there's a huge amount of material that we haven't covered. Apologies for that, but that's the nature, as you all know, of a webinar. Please do stay in touch with us and with each other, of course, to remain your global alumni network. The online mentoring platform, warwickgrad.net, is available, so please do access it to support each other during this challenging time. Do stay up to date, please, with all of the research and events going on at Warwick by visiting our website and connecting with our Facebook and our LinkedIn channels. And we look forward very much to seeing you all at future events. The question of sustainability, as I say, is something that is so vital, not only for the university, but is so vital for the whole world. I think we probably have enough material just today for about 16 webinars. So finally, thank you for everyone for participating. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Georgia.
Thank
and
you.
goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.